somebody had missed a deadline and they had, the publishing slot. They're like, we got to get a book to publish, in this slot that we've set aside. And so it's possible that, there was room for me. And so what I tell writers is, luck plays a part, but you have to be ready when your luck comes around. I had the book ready to go. Whether the luck finds me or not, I've got to be ready.
Writers, agents, booksellers, the people who live by books. This is Life on Words, a podcast about the life behind the work.
I'm Terry Heath, and I'm here with Susan Wiggs. Susan, you've written 75 books.
Really? I kind of stopped counting a couple dozen books ago. And I know that there are 60 novels in my bookcase. And so I say 60 plus, but if you count short stories and nonfiction and compilations and things like that, you're probably right in the zone. Probably 75. Wow.
Yeah.
That makes me feel old.
Well, one source said 74. You've won 3 Rita Awards. You've won a Dorothy Parker Award, the Holt Medallion, the Colorado Award of Excellence, the Blue Boa Award, and your books have been New York Times, USA Today, and Publisher Weekly bestsellers. What has your life and books cost you, and what have been the rewards?
Terry, I've done a lot of chats and interviews and everything, but I've never been asked quite that question. So I'm really happy to think about that for a minute. What does it cost me, and what have been the rewards? What it's cost me is probably at least an entire decade of TV watching, because I sold my first book in 1986, and I was a full-time teacher and full-time mom as well. And so the things that you have to peel away in order to set aside time to write book after book are things like TV. It cost me probably, social time with friends, probably not family, just because I made a priority to make sure that, I never set my family aside for the sake of my career. But, some of those peripheral friendships, the ones that you could take it or leave it, probably, I have to be honest. Sometimes you have to make choices. No, I can't go play around a golf with you, or I can't go on this trip with you, or something like that. So probably that is the first thing that comes to mind of the cost. And also, since we're going to be really honest here, you're a self-employed single, contractor, and that comes with a lot of stress when you decide to be a sole proprietor, writer, and independent contractor. What you invite into your life is some element of uncertainty, anxiety, and stress. And a long writing career, it's a series of peaks and valleys. And so the ups and downs of a writing career, you have to be mentally prepared for that. It's not always going to be smooth sailing. I've had the experience of losing a publisher and having a contract get canceled, and having a lack of support from a publisher where my sales suffered, and you just have to be prepared for that. It's going to happen unless you're sprinkled with pixie dust the entire run of your career. Then I think you have to be prepared for not necessarily the long, Zen-like calm of a steady career. And I did have a steady career. I was a teacher, and teaching it can be chaotic in its own way, but it is predictable. Also, you get up the same time. Your task is similar, and it's very rewarding and lovely, but it's totally different from being an independent contractor. So I suppose that's one of the things that it costs. The rewards are you get creative gratification. I wanted to be a writer from, before I could even write. I would tell my mother stories and she would write them down for me. And so I think that probably, was just ingrained in me. And so I got to be who I was. And I have enormous respect for people who come to writing at any stage of their life. People who do it like right out of the cradle, the way I did, all the way to people who are just retiring. They might be 75, 80, 85 years old and decide, I'm going to sit down and write. And so the rewards are just this unbelievable creative gratification that you get from having to put your words on paper. And when I say paper, I really mean paper. We were talking the other day at your event, and I brought, my original manuscript for every book is a handwritten draft, and so putting pen on paper for me, I find huge gratification in that. And then the other rewards are more public. You make a bestseller list, or you win an award, or you get sales that are financially rewarding. And so those sort of things are definitely tangible. I think maybe one of my favorites was when I had the experience of selling into an imprint. It was called Harper Monogram, and it was with HarperCollins in the early '90s. And there was a guy in the foreign sales department of that publisher who, for some reason, he picked up my book and decided this book is going to have really good run in foreign sales. And he started selling my books all over the world, France and Latvia and China and Russia, just everywhere that you can imagine. And suddenly I had this whole stream of foreign publications. And for some reason, that made me very, I don't know, very proud, very happy to know that somebody that I'll never meet in a country I barely heard of, is reading my book. So that was one of the rewards as well.
Mm. Do you feel like there have been any costs for other people in your life that they didn't necessarily sign up for?
Um, Probably in my case, the opposite. The opposite
Okay.
is that but the more tangible rewards, they knew that they had a very productive member of the family, and who cared very deeply about them. I would say, I do a podcast with my daughter. We're just getting started with that now, and it's interesting to hear her perspective because she was 1 year old when I sold my first book, and has grown up with a writing mom. And I always tried to make sure that she was my priority, not my writing and not my career. And according to her, and she is very brutally honest, she never did feel like I had skipped over her or set her aside in order to pursue the writing career. So it's a balancing act, and any working parent does the balancing act, regardless of what business they're in. You always are feeling like, one thing pulls you away from something else. So it's like I said, it's a balancing act. I do think maybe they a writer's mind will wander. I'll be looking out the window and, my mind is a million miles away. And so we definitely have moments like that. My husband can kind of tell when my eyes glaze over and he knows that I'm just, in my novel instead of in the moment. And so we do have moments like that, but we just kind of laugh about them. And I'm lucky to be with people who understand me and the way my mind works. So hopefully writers have people like that in their lives.
Speaking of people in your lives, was there ever a time when somebody was either encouraging or not encouraging, maybe when you were first getting started that really
Yeah,
helped? Or
especially in the '80s, writing was publishing. I was living in Texas at the time, was such a foreign concept. They didn't quite understand me. My first husband was not supportive. but he kind of went along with it and was not exactly my patron of the arts. I was on my own for that. So there were things like that. But overall, most people, once they kind of got their head around, once you finally come up with a book and it's a tangible thing and you can hold it in their hand, they think, oh, that's what you've been doing. Because I have to say, I was not very public about my writing dream until it looked like it was starting to come true for me. I didn't wanna go around and say, "Oh, I'm writing a novel," because I intrinsically understood. I was really protective of what I was doing. I didn't want somebody to say, "Oh, that's impossible. You'll never do that." A lot of people can be really dismissive in that way, and I think I in the back of my mind, I must have known that because I didn't talk about it to anybody. I just did it, in my free time, my nights and weekends, and so I kind of recommend that. On the one hand, there's power in saying, "I wanna do this, I'm gonna do this." But on the other hand, it can make you feel like you're being challenged in ways that you don't need to be at the moment. So, because I knew that as soon as I said, "Ooh, I'm writing a novel," somebody's gonna say, "Well, when can I read this novel? When is it gonna be published? When is it gonna be done?" And those don't always you don't have answers to those, and it would get tedious to say, "Oh, I really don't know. I don't have an agent. I don't have an editor. I don't have a publisher." And so I just set that aside for myself until I could give a concrete answer. "Oh, I have written a novel. I sold it to Kensington Books." That was my first publisher, and it's going to come out in April 1987, and it did. And then, each year after that, I published a book or 2, so I was on my way.
So during that time, what were you telling yourself? Did you feel like, okay, this is going to be successful, or did you have no idea, or what did you tell yourself when you were kind of getting through that by yourself?
Yeah, I had a lot of hope for myself, and I did have a lot of confidence that I could produce work of a quality as but you're definitely at the mercy of a business that you have very little control over, especially if you're new and you're not a big deal. And I was new and I was definitely not a big deal. I was 27 years old, I guess. And so I kind of had to have enough confidence in myself. You're going to write another book. You're going to win some readers over. And it took some time, but I I never quite got on a track where I just knew that I didn't need a backup plan. And to this day, I feel like, I I still, there's still an insecure part of me that thinks, "Oh, this one's not gonna go. This book's gonna end my career." I actually thought that about my most recent book, Wayward Girls, because it was a bit of a departure from the typical, Susan Wiggs book that I built my whole career on. It's more of a serious matter. It's in a weird time period, 1968 to present day, and I wasn't sure that it would be embraced, but it was a story I felt compelled to tell, and I did have encouragement from my publisher and my literary agent. So, but that's an example of, a writer's insecurities. And I always feel like, writers are one of the most insecure populations that I can think of. We're always feeling like, "Oh, they're gonna read that and they're gonna see something or think something," and it's mostly all in our heads.
Do you think there's going to be more similar to Wayward Girl, or are you going to go back to what you've done
I
before?
I do. I think that, it one book, and any long-term writer will tell you this, one book could lead to another book, and it usually hits, and this is a truth of writing, it usually hits when you're 2/3 of the way through the book that you're working on and you're starting to hate that book, then a better idea comes along and you feel like, "Oh my god, I gotta finish this because I wanna go on to this shiny new idea." And I do have a shiny new idea, and it has to do it takes place it starts in 1975, and and it spans to present day, and it has to do with a incident that took place, not an incident, an operation that took place, a military operation called Operation Baby Lift. And it was a really, really ill-conceived idea that in the aftermath of the war in Vietnam, we were going to bring Vietnamese orphans to the States to give them homes, which on paper maybe sounded like a good idea. And it was one of the most terrible ideas. And we don't hear much about it. Just like we didn't hear about in Wayward Girls, we didn't hear about these mother and baby homes like the Good Shepherd in that book, because it's not, it's not something we can all take pride in. And so I'm just researching that. I'm talking to a lot of older ladies who were Pan Am stewardesses in the 60s, and just kind of finding my way through the research part of that book.
That's 2 books that have to do with mothers and babies.
A lot of
Is that
them do. And
intentional,
in
or-
fact, like I was thinking about, I don't know why. I had one baby. I've got a lovely daughter and 2 lovely stepsons, but and I don't have that kind of turmoil in my life. But I'm very fascinated by it. In Sugar and Salt, there was a adoption storyline, and in several of my books, there's an unplanned pregnancy, because what's more dramatic than that? And so I don't know that it's a theme of mine, but it's something that happens to women in the course of their lives. And that's kind of what all my books are about, I guess.
Do you see these new books as, would you call them women's fiction instead of your standard romance? Or are you trying to...
Definitely not romance. And I
Yeah.
struggle with the term women's fiction. A lot of publishing terms are just generated maybe in meetings with publishers or something like that. And they have to categorize it for well, maybe not as much now, but in the past for the bookstores. When books were typically sold in bookstores instead of online, they had to say, here's where you shelf this book. And sometimes it's obvious. It's science fiction, it's romance, it's a hardcore mystery or something like that. But nowadays, yeah, I don't know that I love the term women's fiction, especially for books like Wayward Girls, because it's a book that anybody can read, whether they're female or not. And
Right.
so when people now ask me what I write, I usually just say novels, commercial novels. And by that, I mean, I'm not going to try to write literature for the ages. I'm not writing the Odyssey. I'm not writing Gravity's Rainbow. But I usually just tell them I write commercial fiction, and you hope that the commerce is good around it and it becomes a bestseller. And it's out of your hands, but that's what you always hope for.
Speaking of that, when did you first start comfortably calling yourself a writer? When people said, "What do you do?" or when did that?
Right when I concretely could say, I wrote a book and I have a publisher. But before that, I would never have said I'm a writer. I might say I'm writing something, a very vague answer like that. But I do like to say that I'm a writer as opposed to author. And because writing is what you do, it's what you sit down every day and get out your materials, and that's what you do. So saying I'm a writer means that I'm actually going to do something. Saying I'm an author means I have done something, and I may or may not do it again today. So I should probably stick to calling myself a writer.
Yeah.
Which is really splitting hairs. I'm sorry, but yeah.
No, yeah. If you weren't calling yourself a writer now, if your writing hadn't taken off, would you still be a math teacher, or what would you be doing?
I would probably be a teacher. Yeah, I would. My mother was a teacher. My sister was a teacher. So yes, I loved that. And it was a really incredibly dynamic and rewarding profession. It was a really hard profession. Don't ever let anybody say, oh, teaching is easy, or your day is short and your summers are long. No. Teachers work as hard as any group of professionals I've ever seen. And it's a lot. And I did love it, but it was a lot. And it was hard to try to do both at the same time. So when I finally found that moment where financially I could afford to let my teaching career, I retired after like 11 years. I think probably that was, it was kind of bittersweet, but I don't advise trying to do both if you really want to be a productive writer. If you want to write a book every, 5 years or whatever, you could probably manage both. And I do know writers who do that, teachers, librarians, other professionals who do both. But I really wanted to focus on the writing. I knew that that was where my heart was.
Hmm. Is there any other part of the pre-writer Susan that didn't survive? The teaching, I think you still teach, just in different ways, but is there any other part of you that you kind of had to leave behind?
Mm, Probably the part who had a very predictable schedule and life. A lot of people in professions, in more predictable professions, they knew they were gonna get this many weeks of vacation time and this many days off and sick days and things like that, and it's all up to you. Once you're an independent contractor, we have a hard time giving ourselves time off. We have a hard time giving ourselves health coverage. In this country, it's kind of a travesty that that's the case, but, yeah, there are ups and downs, financial ups and downs that you face when you're a writer and you're the only income for your family. But so I had to kind of what I left behind in that case was having a more stable, steady, predictable thing. But on the other hand, the reward of that was that I was highly motivated. I was not going to miss a deadline, and I was not going to screw up a book and have it not be good. And so I wonder, if I had had too much of a cushion, would I have been that motivated and that focused? I don't know because, that was the path not taken.
What Describe a day in the writer's life, Susan Wiggs' writer's life. What is that like?
Well, I'm going to idealize a little bit here because, as you heard when we were interrupted, I have dogs, I have family. It's summer, and that means we have guests coming and going constantly. So there's that. But if I set all that aside and say this is a typical writing day, when it, I, I have an uninterrupted time, I almost always do what I call the heavy lifting of writing in the morning. I have to obviously, get my coffee and either go to the gym or dog walk or something like that to sort of get my body going, and then it's time to get my mind going. And I usually sit with my notebook, and I pick up where I left off. I don't go back and reread the previous day. I read the previous page maybe or two, but I don't go back and read the previous day's work. I just sort of push myself through. And that's just for first draft. So let's assume that I'm writing a first draft. I just keep going. Each scene or beat of the story that I write seems to lead into the next. And they're not always great. Often there's a lot of gaps or I know that I'm already going down the wrong path and I have to switch gears. But when I'm in the midst of writing, composing a first draft, that's kind of how it goes. And you can't sustain that for long. I'd like to say I would sit and do it for 8 hours. I don't. I do it for 4 hours until I start wondering if I need to go clean the can opener or if I left my car windows down or something like that. But usually I would say, the ideal for me span of time, and it's different for everybody, is probably just 4 hours of really focused, concentrated work. I try to ignore my watch saying it's time to get up and move around. I've got one of those watches, but no, usually that. But then once you're a published writer, there's a lot of other pieces of your day that are typical. I've got to go check my social media stream and make sure that it looks, like something interesting that readers can scroll by. I have a Substack newsletter that I like to try to, communicate with my subscribers to that. So there are things like that. I call it admin, PR and correspondence, email, things like that, that are typical in any other job because writing is only a part of my day. I'd love for it to be more, but the reality in today's world means you need to have an online presence. It's not mandatory, but I feel like it's expected by commercial publishers now. And I don't have a lot of familiarity with independent um, publishing. So I don't know how that works, but I assume it's even more because they have to be their own producers, they have to be their own editors, and so forth. And so I feel like respect to those people because they're wearing a lot of hats. And I feel like wearing my writer hat and then my admin hat kind of takes up my day. And I actually love to cook and garden. And so those are my other two things that I do. I know how to knit. I have, some crafts. I have this adorable family. It's a lovely husband. And so a lot of my day belongs to them now, especially at this phase of my life now that I'm an old grandma. So it's rather nice. But I've done what it takes. When I was younger and I had deadlines and a little kid and all kinds of challenges like that, I sort of got the work done. And I and so here we are. And it's a great I don't know, it's a great feeling to sort of look back and see the things that I've written, and that's one of the reasons that I'm enjoying podcasting so much because, it gives you a chance to reflect. Because in a typical day, you don't sit there and go, "Oh, look at my career. Look what I've written," but, when
See
you
what you've
get
done.
the opportunity to talk to people like Terry, then, it's really gratifying to revisit these things and appreciate them. So thank you.
Is there a time when you shut off from writing? Do you have like not office hours per se, but a cutoff time? Like, nope, it's after this time. I'm not doing anything.
I definitely try to do that because you don't want to be just a life support system for an imagination. It's tough to shut off your imagination when there's stories in your head. It feels kind of all consuming. But one of my favorite is to read. I feel and writers have trouble being really good attentive readers because it's sort of like we're more analytical probably than a non-writer when we're reading a book, and it slows us down, and I think, "Oh, how did they do that?" But my favorite kind of book is the one that makes me forget that I'm a writer, where I'm just
Mm.
so into the story. I'm just so loving it. And, so those are my escape hatches, that and, I do a lot of hiking and biking and physical things like that, and that is essential for balance. I worry about writers who are very interior and very sedentary because I think that part of a healthy writing career means keeping yourself physically healthy. And I won't get on my high horse about that, but let's take care of ourselves.
When you are reading other books, along the way, have there been authors that you've either tried to model yourself after in the books or outside of the books, or maybe even been a little bit envious of their career and wanted
Oh,
to,
all of the above. I would love to have, Stephen King's career. I would love to be able to write as compelling suspense as, say, who am I thinking of? James Lee Burke. Things like that. Yeah, there are writers that I read with admiration, but also, envy not so much, because every successful writer, really, really good writer, I know they've put the work in. And um, so I can't be envious of somebody who's worked really, really hard and been really, really successful because I know what it takes. And so I mostly appreciate these writers for being, books that I can read. And I I was a reader from probably age 4. I actually have the first book I ever read independently. It's called The Carrot Seed by Ruth somebody. I can't remember now, but it's a classic. Oh, Krauss, Ruth Krauss, The Carrot Seed. It's a tiny little picture book with only a few words on every page. But when I was 4, I read it all by myself. And I think not coincidentally, it's about a boy who plants a carrot seed, and everybody in his life says it won't come up. Mom says it's not going to come up. And his dad says, sorry, it's not going to come up. The other one's not going to come up. And every day he weeds the weeds and he waters the seed. And of course, the big moment in the end, the carrot seed comes up and he gets a big carrot and everybody's all proud of him. And I'm thinking, that's a story about striving and being steady. And so it's no coincidence that was the first book that I read all by myself.
Speaking of your younger self, is there anything that either you would want to tell your younger self or would purposefully not want to tell your younger self from either your writing life or just your life in general?
Oh, that's a clever question. The second part of that question, what would I want to keep from myself? Because, life as it unfolds is so fascinating. You don't want any spoilers ahead. I think if I'm being super honest, I probably would advise myself to, honor my own self and my own time more than I did. I gave a lot to a marriage that wasn't the right marriage for a long time, and I don't want to undo anything though, because everything that I've done has brought me here. So that's a really tricky question. You don't want to spoil the future for your future self, but on the other hand, you're thinking, it didn't have to be that hard. You should have taken a shortcut. So I don't know. Is it fair to give ourselves shortcuts? I think we try to do that with our kids, don't we? We try to, tell them about the pitfalls, and then they ignore us, and we get frustrated with them. And then I realize, oh, well, maybe they need to stumble and fall and get themselves up. And so I don't know. That's an interesting question to contemplate.
Well, it makes me think of the old thing. If you traveled back in time, you would change the future. So I guess, you don't know
Mhm.
if you did tell yourself something, if you have ended up being where you are now and it wouldn't have mattered or, you know.
Right. Well, if I'd had a more supportive partner, I wouldn't have worked so hard. If I, wasn't so independent in my writing, would I have put the work in? And, I think one of the things that's brought me to where I am now, which is in a really nice, comfortable position with, lots of published books, and is probably because I did make myself work so hard. And would I have if I had, if my comfort level was higher? I don't know. Yeah, there's no control group for that.
Is there anything that's come in your writing career that nobody warned you about?
Nobody warned me about. Mm, no, not really. Not really, because I've had really good representation. I've been with 3 different literary agents. The latest one, I think we've been a couple. Meg Ruley at the Jane Rosen Agency, and I think we've been a couple for maybe 30 years. But previous to that, I had 2 other agents, and I got really good advice from them. And the editors that I worked with you have the same goal. You always want your the book to succeed. And so I always feel like I've had good advice in that way, and fellow writers as well. I've had the good luck to have writers as mentors, and giving me advice. And most writers are really they're very generous about that and honest. And so I feel like when you talk shop with a writer, you get the straight story. And there used to be, it's still here. There used to be some industry publications that I feel like if you really want to be in this business, you need to familiarize yourself with probably Publishers Weekly and it used to be Writer's Digest. And I believe they're both still, online publications, things like that. Join the Authors Guild. Go to, meetings of other authors. Go to Terry Heath's events because it
Please.
does round you out as a writer and it makes you feel like you're part of a community, even though the work that you do has to be done all alone in a room. But as a part of the business, I always felt like I knew how to to find information and be informed.
Obviously, you've worked hard, but has there been any part of your career that you feel was just luck?
Oh, yes. Yeah, for sure. It's kind of like the bad luck leads to better luck. I was with an imprint. It was called the Avon Romance, and they were historical romances. And this imprint just closed. They stopped publishing them. And so I needed to go somewhere else. And so I wrote another historical romance called The Lily and the Leopard. And at the same time, at that moment, um, another imprint was starting up at another publisher. It was called the Harper Monogram imprint at HarperCollins Publishers, and they needed a book to launch their line. And so, I that was luck. I got to be the first book, and when you're first, they put a lot more promotion behind you. And so it sort of pushed me up the ladder. And actually my very first book that I sold, it was called Texas Wildflower, and it was a Western romance. I think that one reason that they bought it from me so quickly and published it so quickly because I sold it in September of 1986 and it came out the next April. I think it might have been because somebody had missed a deadline and they had, the publishing slot. They're like, we got to get a book to publish, in this slot that we've set aside. And so it's possible that, somebody there was room for me. And so what I tell writers is luck plays a part, but you have to be ready when your luck comes around. I had the book ready to go. Whether the luck finds me or not, I've got to be ready. And so, yeah, I guess that's the advice. Be ready when your luck comes around.
What was it like back then with you said in your podcast that it was almost like they were publishing a magazine. They had to get out so many books all the time. Did you write faster to try to fill that need than you might have otherwise? Or what was that? What was life like then as a writer for you?
Well, I think I always would have been a fast writer just because for me, momentum kind of propels me forward. But I think also back then these paperback romances of both there were some that were like Harlequin was doing. I didn't write for Harlequin at the time, but they were doing, they had 4 books a month and you could subscribe to them like you could a magazine, and the historical romances had to come out a certain number per month because they sold like wildfire. And so it definitely the industry was a little bit different. It was much more it worked like the magazine, and the paperback originals, the rack size paperback, which they don't even publish anymore. That format has gone. But back then they even I think that I think this is right. I think that the spinning racks were invented by somebody who decided that the size of a paperback should be a certain thing. And
Oh,
then they could go in the mass market. They could go in the grocery stores and the drugstores and the variety stores instead of just bookstores. And so the industry kind of revolved around being regular. And booksellers at the time, they said, like Tuesdays, were the sacred day because the very avid readers would be there. The new shipment of books would come in on Tuesdays. And that's still the traditional day in commercial publishing that books come out. And so I think it the pace of it made room for a lot of writers to be published, and and you just hope that your readers will follow you. And I'm so grateful to readers, and I have to give a shout out to librarians too because they keep your name alive in ways that you can't even. I just count on librarians and booksellers to really promote the authors.
Well, like back in the noir times, Dashiell Hammett and authors like that, James Cain, there was kind of a framework, a grid for them to work in. There were magazines publishing those kinds of stories, and there were books being cranked out quickly, and a lot of writers were able to develop their craft kind of in public in a way that maybe they wouldn't have been able to if that hadn't been around. And it sounds like maybe when you started writing, it was a similar kind of thing. There were a lot of opportunities. Not that that's the only reason you were able to get published, but there were
Well,
magazines, there were.
yes, yes, and, I think it was Stephen King who says a writer's apprenticeship is 1,000,000 words. Or
Mhm.
some crazy number like that. And
Yeah.
so, and I do know writers who started out by writing there was a genre of magazine called confessionals. You know, I was cheating on my husband or, something like that. And they wrote them anonymously. And they were these pulpy magazines that came out. And it's a great training ground to just get your words on paper and shape a story. And whether you're doing it for a pulpy magazine or a novel or even a literary work, it pulls the words out of you. And so I think I respect any path that people take to get to writing. Some people study it in school. Some people avoid. I actually avoided studying it in school. I have a bachelor's degree from Texas and a master's degree from Harvard. And in both cases, I writing was not my focus because I felt like I needed to protect my voice. And I was also too insecure to kind of come out in a class or something like that. Nowadays, I recommend it because I think there's a lot more room for people who have commercial voices and want to, write best-selling novels, not just literature and, literary works.
How is it today then, starting out? Is it different now than it was when you started? Are there as many opportunities or more? What do you see?
That's a tricky question too, because on the one hand, there are fewer print publications, many fewer, way, way, way fewer, but there are a zillion online publications, and so your route is probably different. Like, how does somebody start a blog and then suddenly, a fan blog about um, the Twilight Saga, and it morphs into Shades of Grey. That thing exploded, and I can't see how that would have happened without the internet. Um, on the other hand, there are so many voices. How does something stand out? And so, boy, that's really tricky. I think there are a lot of opportunities, but it's going to take a huge strategy that I feel a little lucky in that I don't have to figure out the whole new the whole new dynamic. Somebody getting started today would probably have a different runway than I had. And so, I can't give advice about that, but I can sure say, good luck.
Has anything ever made you want to walk away?
No. No, the closest that I've come, and it's actually an ongoing thing, and it's not that I want to walk away, but last year, in August 2025, I had a major, devastating, bicycle wreck. I was on my way to the farmer's market, riding my bike behind my husband, and there was an unmarked speed bump in the road, and I went up and over and I flipped and I had a kind of head injury called a Lefort 3, which basically means you broke every bone in your face. And I had to be airlifted to a trauma center. And, thank God for Harborview Hospital in Seattle. They put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But a head injury. I'd never had one. Hopefully, nobody ever has to have one. But it's kind of in a class by itself in that it's not an injury that you just heal from and move on with your life. It's an ongoing thing when your brain is bleeding and you're having surgeries to put your face back together. It's it definitely, it slowed me down. And talk about luck being a part of my career. I had just finished Wayward Girls. It had just come out, and that was the final book in a multi-book contract that I had with my publisher. And so I wasn't forced to have to sit down, with my head trauma and write
Oh,
another
yeah,
book. And I
yeah.
knew I wanted to, but I knew that I physically and mentally couldn't. I was my vision was affected, and my everything, and so including my screen time. I'm supposed to only have like 2 hours of screen time and things like that, and so that was not a decision that I made, but it did show me, oh well, there are things besides writing in your life, and so and I have to shout out to my publisher and my agent. They've been incredibly supportive, when they heard what happened to me. But that's probably the only time I thought, well, maybe I'm going to not write.
Oh,
But
geez.
that's actually coming to an end. Things get better every day, and we'll see what comes out of me next.
Now, I think I heard you say that when you got the idea for Wayward Girls, you were supposed to write a beach reads story.
Yes.
Is that
Well,
what? Yes.
not supposed to, but it was
Oh,
expected. When you
oh.
pick up, let's say, you pick up a book by Debbie Macomber, you expect that it's going to be, this kind of cozy, homey family story,
Mm.
with a love story. When you pick up, a Stephen King novel, it's going to be a surreal, probably horror novel, something like that. And so I think expectations get built around, certain writers. Maybe it's going to be a funny mystery, maybe, and so I was kind of the beach read person, and I did something a little subversive that people don't always remark on because of the way the books are packaged. They look like a beach read, but there's often like we talked earlier, an unplanned pregnancy, or, a workplace drama, or, some kind of abuse or something like that, or, a matter of justice, but it's folded into this love story. And so I was kind of the beach read. Probably one of my best covers and bestsellers. It was called Just Breathe. And the cover featured a girl on the beach just looking out to sea. And readers just loved that book. But it was about a failed marriage and artificial insemination. And so there's always an issue that you can hang it on. And so um, but that I think that defined the kind of book that people expected from me. And there was just no beach in Wayward Girls. Nobody's going to go surfing or, get a sunburn or anything like that. It was definitely a different thing. And I did love writing that book. But I think a writer can writers fall in love with whatever they're writing. And so if I decide that, oh, I got to go back to the beach, um, I'll fall in love with that again. So I just do it one book at a time. And I'm a fan of writers who can juggle multiple projects, but I usually just pursue one book at a time.
Mhm. Is the 1975 book the next one? Is that what you're working on
Well,
now?
it doesn't I haven't finished it, and, I haven't given it to a publisher yet. I do have a book that's on submission. It was a book that I had, finished before, and it wasn't, it was one of those books that, I knew that it needed more work, and, I wasn't quite sure what direction I needed to take it, but even with my head injury, I was able to sort of, when you have a finished piece that needs work, it's a really creative process, but it's a little different. And so I kind of rewrote a whole book. And so we'll see what my publisher thinks of that. Um, I don't think that I'm gonna make any kind of big change in my career or anything like that. I kinda like the direction it's been going. So hopefully I will keep writing, I will keep writing and rewriting. And another thing that's been really gratifying in my career is that books can be reissued, repackaged, reissued, and so it feels like there's always something fresh out.
So then your process, you write in a tablet by hand, um, no outline.
No, I do. I do. I usually write a pitch, and that's something like a one-page summary, and those are so hard for me to write because, I write I'm a long format writer, but I try to distill the book that I'm planning down to one page. And once I do that, I show it to my literary agent. We show it to my editor, and then, we there might be some discussion back and forth, but then they give me the green light. And after that, I write a a pretty detailed synopsis for me, just so that I see the beats of the story. And that, probably runs 10 to 20 pages. And that's my roadmap. I try to leave room for my imagination and my characters to take on a life of their own, because sometimes things happen that I didn't see coming or plan in the book. And I love those moments, and I recommend them, because that's kind of one of the exciting things about writing a book, is that your characters surprise you, your own voice surprises you. And so I leave room for that. But I would say that I almost always know the beginning and the end of the story, and then, things develop through the middle. Like, I always knew the way Wayward Girls would end. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I was really compelled by the situation of the Good Shepherd, this place where they would send girls with unplanned pregnancies, or girls who'd failed out of the foster care system, or for whatever reason. I always knew the end, because in what happened in the news was that New York, the state of New York, where it took place, um, um, enacted something called a look back law, where they took away the statute of limitations. If you'd been harmed, it used to be, you had to bring suit against, whoever harmed you within, I don't know, 3 to 7 years or something like that. And those obviously had all run out for women who had been abused in 1968. But the look back law enabled people to find justice um, when they realized that they'd been abused that long ago. And so I always knew there would be the court case at the end.
Mm,
And,
mm.
I'll try not to spoil too much, but I knew that that would give me the ending that would make sense for me and for the book.
Is there anything about your life as a writer that people get wrong, misconceptions or
Um, Misconceptions about
assumptions?
writers. Some people, well, it's funny, there's a spectrum. Some people think, oh my God, you're a writer. You must, be poor as a church mouse scraping by. And then other people say, oh my gosh, you're a writer. You're a billionaire. And so I think it's because it's not a familiar profession. And it's true that, a writer's income can span from 4 figures to 7 figures, or even, I don't know, maybe 8 figures if you're, a mega successful. But I think that probably they get wrong how much, how much a writer makes. And then they also, things they get wrong, how much a writer has to work. It's such a pleasure to sit and read a book. I actually had a reader come up to me, and she said, I'm a really fast typist. And so I could probably write a book in a weekend, because I got a weekend coming up. And somebody else once told me, a woman speaks 30,000 words a day. And so if a book is 100,000 words long, maybe she could just like talk the book into her phone. So there are definitely misconceptions about that. But the other thing is, everybody's a storyteller. We live our lives in stories, whether we're writers or not. Think about conversations you have with friends, or parties that you go to, or things like that. People love to speak in stories. And so, but you can't conflate that with actually writing a structured novel. For me, anyway.
What's the most unglamorous thing you had to do this week as a writer?
The most unglamorous thing I had to do. I hate this answer, but it's email. You sit there and you have to deal with each individual subject. And sometimes it's lovely. Somebody gives you a shout out or, gives you something to do, but a lot of it has to do with, your bookkeeper and, the admin stuff, very unglamorous. And, um, some writers, I think, have to do, like, really unglamorous research. I love research, I love doing it, but some readers, have to, I don't know, um, crawl underground and do something, I don't know, but, I find it all grist for the mill, but, yeah, and the other unglamorous thing is it is really challenging to be self-employed, probably in any state. I'm in the state of Washington. You've gotta structure a whole business around, your limited liability company and looking after things. There's nobody that organizes it, nobody's gonna write you a paycheck, nobody's gonna pay your bills for you, that's all you, and so that's not super glamorous. It's not my favorite.
Mm.
We mentioned at the top of this, the rewards are make it so worthwhile, so worth it. I wouldn't change a thing.
Is there a place that you sat in, a room that you sat in metaphorically during your career that you would not want to revisit?
Oh. Wow, is there a place that I've sat in that I would not want to revisit? You know, it would be it would be an event. I'm not thinking of a specific one. Unfortunately, I've had several of these. An event where, that had not been, properly thought out or publicized where a book signing or something like that, that was just a complete flop where there was no interaction. I feel like I went to a lot of trouble and, did my best and was just ignored, things like that. And I actually wrote about it. I wrote a book called The Lost and Found Bookshop, and there's one scene in the book. She's an independent bookseller. She's got a really charming bookshop, and this nice lady writer comes to do her event, and nobody comes. And I would love to say that that's never happened to me, but unfortunately, it's probably happened to most writers that I know where um, I try to get the word out, but how do you do that anymore? And I always try to, you bring flowers for the table and you bring the candy bowl or something like that. But I've had events where I've been the only customer in the bookshop and I end up, buying a stack of books and taking them home and feeling really bad that, things hadn't been, more active. So I would say events like that, and it's a chemical thing. Some readers will line up around the block. One of the earliest book signings I ever went to was for Anne Rice. She wrote Interview with a Vampire, and in the 80s and early 90s, she was hugely popular. And I remember going to a signing where they gave you, numbers, take a number, and you had to show up at a certain hour, and people were lined up around the block. Some people have that chemistry with readers. Nora Roberts has it, the author. Um, Jodi Picoult. They draw a crowd. They're just they've got that X factor, and I don't know what it is. I feel like I don't have that, and it's I make no apologies, but I I actually give credit to my readers because you know what? My readers are just readers. They don't need to meet me. They love my books. They want to stay home and read them, and I feel like it's not their job to come out and, stroke my ego and meet
Mm.
me. I love when I do meet readers, but that's not what I'm about and that's not what books are about. And so I just, I make my peace with that. It's like I'm not famous enough to draw a crowd unless something happens, like, there are certain library events that I've been to, where you walk out on the stage and the auditorium's full, and it's kind of shocking to me, but I love it. I love to talk books, and so, I'm not sure what chemistry it takes to create something like that, but I'm always grateful when it happens.
Mhm. So what's next? Do you know?
I'm yes, I do know, and it's I'm obviously going to be reading and writing, but I'm going to see an eclipse. It's happening on August 12th, and I'm going to be in the full darkness of the eclipse on
Ah,
August 12th in the middle of the North Sea on a boat. And
my gosh.
so, yeah, I know. I have a taste for eclipses. They're so dramatic when you're in the full darkness. They're pretty interesting when you're kind of on the edge of an eclipse, but when you're in the full darkness, there was one on the Oregon coast in 2017, and then there was one like it kind of was a swath through the country in April 2024. Like I was in the Texas Hill Country watching that, and I even learned the word for it. I'm an umbraphile. That's somebody who has an affinity for eclipses. And I'm very grateful that there's somebody who can calculate when and where and what time the eclipse is going to happen years in advance. And so we heard about this one, a couple of years ago and thought, oh, we should go to Iceland. But it was hard to book anything in Iceland. So we realized that we could book a boat trip. And so I'm going to be in the North Sea, hopefully in calm waters. Clear skies would be nice. And so
Mm,
that's going to happen on August 12th. And the boat lands in Iceland. And then we're going to go we're going to go tour Scandinavia because we never have. My husband's fully Norwegian and he's never been there. And so that's going to be the rest of the summer. And it's an unusual trip for me to take because of where we live. We live in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm probably letting the cat out of the bag, but this is the nicest place for summer on the globe. We have gorgeous summers. We have like lovely temperate weather, minimal bugs. Just like it's pretty perfect here in August and September. And so I almost never leave, but because of the eclipse, I'm going to be gone for most of August. So that's what's next.
mm,
I'm bringing my e-reader stuffed with books to read, and
mm.
obviously my notebook and my pen, and so that's what's next for me.
Life on Words is produced by Terry Heath and Follow the Rabbit LLC. New conversations post every Wednesday. Follow the show wherever you listen and find every episode at lifeonwords.com.